Welcome to week 2. This is part 3 of your virtual lectures for week 2 of class. And in this lecture, we are going to specifically spend some time talking about and understanding scenario planning, um, especially in a view of how to use scenario planning to deal with uncertainty, especially when tied into things like Lego and the case that you've been reviewing in the assignment that you have. I found a couple of quotes which help me related to understanding scenario planning, and this one from Pierre Wack is good. In times of rapid change, strategic failure is often caused by a crisis of perception that is the inability to see an emergent novel reality by being locked inside obsolete assumptions, particularly in large, well-run companies. To me, I read this as companies change when they don't think outside the box, when they're not looking at what could happen, when they're not getting into a decision tree model in terms of I'll look at the Baltimore Ravens and the Chicago Bears and the Denver Broncos and all the different teams that have had assistant coaching changes or head coaching changes. What do the Ravens do to any of the changes they have from a coordinator perspective? What do the Browns do now that they need an offensive coordinator, or the Bears do now that they have a new head coach? And were they ready for it? It brings up another quote from the Adaptive Corporation. I mistrust isolated trends. In a period of rapid change, strategic planning based on straight-line trend extrapolation is inherently treacherous. What is needed for planning is multidimensional models that interrelate forces, technological, social, political, even cultural, along with economies. What are companies doing to be one step ahead, and how are they gambling on the future? For myself, I knew going in that the group that I run lacked specific technical knowledge in products where our competitors were gaining expertise. And we made a calculated risk decision to buy a company in Denmark that specifically A, had the skills that we needed, and B, was able to support from a European hub perspective. We looked at scenarios in terms of what would happen if we made the acquisition, what would happen if we didn't, and I was able to convince the board that we needed to make that acquisition. Now, I would not be able to do that without dealing with some probability of future events. I had to put information together. So from an assumption perspective, I thought this was good. The managers can't make valid assessments of probability. You're having to make guesses. And you're oftentimes going to make the wrong guesses. So best guesses of the future may be wrong. But you also need to look at the what ifs, and the minority from a view perspective need to be listened to. For my team, it was, okay, what happens if we don't make this acquisition? What will happen to our existing team? What happens if we do make the acquisition? What will the other product companies do? What will our partners think? How will our staff adjust? We had to look at the pros and cons of each and every angle. So what we did is we put through some scenarios. In terms of if we did the acquisition, if we didn't do the acquisition, if one of our competitors did the acquisition, because the scenario isn't a forecast of the future, but it allows you to see a lot of plausible futures. When you were kids, you probably read a book called Choose Your Own Adventure, where you can go to the end of each chapter and make a multiple choice selection, which will then take you to a certain page within the book. Scenario planning is similar to Choose Your Own Adventure. It's just from a business perspective to give you that planning. It's going to give you different ranges of probabilities, but it's going to give you in a constructed, bound way that's inherent to the future. Just like the Choose Your Own Adventure book, you had only a set number of outcomes, but you had multiple ways that you can get there. And unlike probability, going with scenario approaches gives you some underlying judgment around, okay, if X happens, then Y should happen as well. Now, most companies use scenarios to map out the future from a short-term perspective. For me, I looked at it when we made the acquisition for the next 18 months, from where I was right then essentially to where we are now. And I tried to map out from a scenario perspective all of the different uncertainties and trends and behaviors that could happen. What if the company that we were buying and the products that they supported, what if the product went out of business? What if there was changes in the technology space? What if there were changes in ownership prior to the acquisition getting done? Like, what were the different pros and cons of different things that were happening, and how did we account for it? What were we doing and how are we testing for robustness? So when you're looking at it, when you're looking at scenario constructions, I map it back out essentially into a number of keys. First, you need to identify the issue, and when I say the horizon year, I mean the time period that you're looking at this scenario. You need to identify the trends that are going to have an impact on your scenario, as well as identify the uncertainties. Understand what's happening and what could potentially happen that could trigger and cause problems. And you need to look at whether those trends and uncertainties will have a negative or a positive effect on what you're doing. For me, for example, the company that we bought does a lot of work with SAP. And if SAP made the decision to not push work out to partners, my making this acquisition would be very detrimental because I was making the acquisition because they're pushing more out to partners. So I had to create scenarios where it was not viewed properly by the product companies we support. But I also had to come the others where they gave us even more work, so I could look at what's the middle of the road, it's the internal consistency, and then what actions of my board, of myself, of my other leadership team, of the company that we were buying, how do those actions add up? So I'm adding in the actions of the individuals, and I'm looking for trends. When you're looking at trends in some scenarios, you're going to find demographic trends. You're going to, if you're looking at things like Nike or McDonald's. McDonald's, great example. Population growth. Like, where do they want to put more McDonald's? Do they tend to go more and target children or adults? Starbucks, for example, they're going to look at an average age. What's the demographic of where they're going to want to put new locations? What is the technology demographic? What is the political demographic? What is the culture demographic? What is the economic demographic? This is going to drive all the different decisions that you're going to make from a scenario perspective. Does Istanbul need a Radio Shack? Does downtown Baltimore need an Apple store? Can it support it? Can it not support it? What's the view? What are the needs? Because it's going to really show you different items. Like, so if we look at Loyola from a business school perspective and the different programs that they have, how are they determining whether or not to offer more classes online or not? What's the driving factor behind that? Is brick and mortar what's necessary? Does the professional MBA program really fill a need? Does the executive MBA program make sense? Like, what are we doing to increase revenue? Are we adding support? Is it becoming more attractive to students? All of these different areas allow you to then come back and put together different scenarios across it. What scenario A, Loyola offers something fully online. Scenario B, Loyola offers partially online. Scenario C, they offer no online. Like, coming up with the different strategies and understanding how the strategies map the scenario, and then mapping out a decision tree will allow you to get to the different items. So when you look at negotiations, a series of yes, no's, I do almost everything I do. I'm thinking in my head, I'm mapping out this decision tree. I'm not doing things like lame duck and macroeconomic populism. It's the only slide I can find that really showed it the right way. But the same general concept of mapping out a decision tree and really looking at how I am managing and handling my shareholders and maintaining their interest in the acquisition, maintaining their power for the organization. When should a company like Lego use scenario planning? When should a company like GP or Loyola or Legg Mason or any of the organizations that you work for use scenario planning? One, when uncertainty is high. If you're looking at new product development, if you're looking at new lines of service, let's do the scenario planning to make sure it makes sense. Two, if too many costly surprises have occurred in the past. You look at wearable devices. I talk about Apple getting out of the fuel ban. Microsoft is now in this space. I'm sure they went through a number of scenario planning in terms of whether or not they should enter in the space. 3, insufficient new opportunities are perceived or generated. What is really next in the space? 4, the industry has experienced significant change or is about to. Wearable devices are about to blow up. Microsoft, maybe they're thinking that Apple got out too early, or Nike got out too early. And then 5, a strong difference of opinion exists and each of it has its merits. If there's strong players on either end of the spectrum, there's usually some growth in the middle. Typically what you'll see from scenario planning is a very decisive, this is what we have to do. And it's going to be based off the type of decision maker you are. Or if you're more strategic, you're going to be more analytic and you're going to say, we better think again. And you're going to look at the details better. Or we better watch out for those dots on the horizon, for the people that are seeing the forest through the trees. I'm going to say that 100 more times in the next 6 weeks is you have to see the forest through the trees in these decisions. You have to see the decisions, the outcome of your decisions, and scenario planning helps you to do that to show that you're either on the right track, the wrong track, or whether or not it's something that you have to do. You have to be able to look and move forward with confidence in order to be successful from a scenario planning perspective, and it helps you tremendously from a decision theory perspective. This ends part 3 of